Chapter 3 is positionality. So what actually is your positionality? Well, basically, subjectivity guides everything. It lays bare the biases, your beliefs, your assumptions. It's the question of who you are, or in my case, who I was in relation to what is happening, the journey, the participants. It is important because what are your underlying interests? What's the underpinning assumptions? It's about having that explicit self-consciousness and self-assessment and having that open and honest discourse. Through your positionality is being able to address the role of your power, your privilege and your visibility within the research. So what actually is mine? What was my own motivation behind this? So I touched on this a little bit in the introduction. So I dislike others talking for me. So what appeared to me coming out through the practitioner inquiry research and what I was reading and hearing about it is that we appeared to be talking for the NQTs, that they were lacking a voice in these initiatives, these programs that we were putting in. I'm also critical of mandatory assessed practitioner inquiry. I'm not critical of practitioner inquiry in itself, and particularly practitioner inquiry as a stance I really do believe in. But to make it mandatory, to make it assessed, I had some doubts about this, and this is what I wanted to explore. And I'll talk more about the doubts, obviously, in later chapters in this. But there was something else, and maybe this is the more neurodivergent side of it. As I mentioned previously, you need a grab or an itch. So I was at a well-known practitioner inquiry researchers lecture that they were giving on practitioner inquiry in Glasgow. And behind me, 2 quality improvement officers, so those are the senior managers in the local authorities in Scotland, from one of our bigger local authorities, was sitting behind me. And what I heard from them at the end was basically how they could manipulate this practitioner inquiry and what the NQTs were to do in their local authority to meet their outcomes of the single outcome agreements, or, to meet their local authority improvement plan. And I thought, whoa, this is not on. So let's just actually go and have a look at that. So that's probably where this journey started. And ultimately that I wanted a wider organisational conversation to have about this. So this is sort of the position that I was coming into this with. But there are other ones, other areas to look at in terms of positionality. So what I did was actually did a social identity mapping. So those were the obvious things that were affecting how I was coming into the research. But what about me as myself, from a rural background, for being female, all these cultural influences. And it was about actually dissecting each influencing and the interactions and the emotions that are underpinning this. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go into any great depth in this in my thesis because ultimately I was restricted to the 50 to 55,000 words, but it was really important that I took the time to actually have a look at that and to look in depth and to question, and using those social identity mapping really helped me do that. And some things with your identity are more fixed, such as culture, and some are more fluid, change over time and space. But the important thing is, once these are identified, is being able to look at how to be able to mitigate these when doing the research. So I did this in sort of 2 ways. One was, when carrying out the research, I did it in a local authority that was new to me, as in that I'd never worked there, and therefore had limited site-specific knowledge of how the local authority operated or their key values. I also approached it from the fact, and being honest, that I was a current school leader at that point in time, and I had been an NQT in Scotland. So, you know, I was mitigating that I wasn't actually totally new coming into the arena that these NQTs were operating in. Also looked at it in terms of the grounded theory using the reflective journal, so that I was also being cognizant of where my positionality was changing throughout the research, and also continue to investigate and to clarify these. And I basically asked myself three key questions throughout this that I detailed in the chapter. There was also looking at the relationships regarding the positionality, and my position in relation to the participants, to their situation. And this is known as your emic or your etic um, situation. So, ontologically, this was emic rather than etic. Etic it couldn't be because etic relies on you being culturally neutral, which is not really possible with with the grounded theory. There was emic, so basically that emic is where you have your prior theories and assumptions are discarded and disregarded so that the truth voice could be heard. Now, I did this, you know, because I was using the Garuns, I was using in vivo codes, as detailed basically in chapter 2, but I was also using the verbatim quotes throughout. So again, using this to reduce the subjectivity that again, you know, is kind of key within positionality and making sure that you are trying to mitigate your subjectivity, your positionality, your bias throughout of this. But my position within this was also to do with the insider-outsider debate that Hare and Anderson talk about in 2014. So I positioned myself centrally, which is unusual to do. It's rare to do, but not impossible. But it was possible for me to do this in this situation because I would classify as an outsider, and this was important in aspects of this, that I did not work for the local authority. I did not know the people they were talking about. I'm not from that particular area. But I was an insider also. I could identify with the rural background. I had lived familiarity of the situations they were finding themselves in terms of the more remote or rural schools. I had what is perceived as to be cultural competence, and that allowed me to ask more insightful questions than those that might not understand. I mean, I remember one situation where we were having the conversation and some kids walked in and the conversation moved to Gaelic and then back into English again, and I totally could see how that happens, and you know, it really wasn't an issue, and I could empathise with the NQT I was talking to at that point in time. Throughout all of this, there are ethical considerations that had to take place regarding this around positionality. So I had to be aware about what the NQTs were reflecting on was also in relation to how they felt at that point of time. So the climate they were operating in was of course going to affect their reflections. And again, an evidence of this was about whose inquiry was this? And I do wonder, you know, if some of those that we're talking about, when I rapidly realised that for those that are doing inquiry, many of them, it wasn't actually their inquiries, it was the schools, the school leaders or their mentors' inquiry, their chosen topic, how they would have gone about doing it that was happening. You know, if they were doing it in a different climate, how would they then feel about the practitioner inquiry? And again, I talk about this later in the thesis with it. But this is where reflexivity in grounded theory also comes to the fore, because in relation to how they were reflecting on the climate they were operating on and their perceptions about that point in time, I also had to be careful to avoid the assumptions on that I was making about their perspectives, based on my own perspectives. And again, journaling came throughout of this. Moving a little bit away from positionality, I'm going to make another sort of perhaps neurodivergent observation on this when doing or looking at creating the mind map for this particular chapter. Is when you go back and have a look at how something has been written or what you've done, I became very aware about how often I would quote particular authors. And now looking back through the other sections of the paper and conversations I had with my supervisors at the time, it is potentially a neurodivergent thing, is that you find an author and someone's paper that you totally, utterly understand. And you know that you're supposed to reference many other folk as well and cross-reference it. But the problem is, when you're neurodivergent, is you get really stuck in one particular paper. That is what you remember, that is what you agree with. And yes, you know that you're supposed to go elsewhere, but by golly, you cannot, it's just, it's almost like this massive barrier that stops you moving, because yes, I want to do that, but that's what I'm thinking. Yes, I know I'm supposed to do that, but I agree with him. And so on and so forth. And particularly when I'm reading this chapter back, I can totally see. So go Holmes.